In one of my very first videos on this channel, I talked about how Pixar has something of a problem when it comes to world building in a few of their movies. And you can find a link in the description to that video in case you're curious. And one specific example I brought up in that video is a scene in the movie Onward where Barley and Ian use a magical disguising spell in order to get out of trouble with two police officers. Because the thing is, when you really stop and think about it, the logistics of that scene make absolutely no sense. And it's clear that it was done that way only because it helped move the story along. And as a result, it makes for perhaps the stupidest scene in the entire movie. And I'd also like to give my usual spoiler warning, as I'm going to be addressing a couple of important plot points in this video. And please forgive me if I get a little angry once or twice, but if you haven't already noticed, this topic annoys me a bit. Okay, so with that out of the way, let's get right into it. Alright, let me just start by saying I don't actually think Onward is a bad movie. I personally enjoyed it and found a couple of the concepts that they introduced quite interesting. I did hate the ending though, but I'll do a separate video on that. The point is, on the whole, I don't hate this movie. But as a writer and just a regular old guy, I do believe that aforementioned scene is an extremely poorly thought out one, and I can easily explain to you why that is. And just to quickly clarify for those of you who don't know, in the movie, magic users can conjure up magical spells to help them with whatever it is they need to do. However, for each spell, there is some kind of stipulation that must be met in order for it to work, and the more demanding the spell, the harder the stipulation is. Now, there's no problem as far as that goes, as it makes complete sense and fits in perfectly with the world that's already been established. However, the problem does come in when they're using the disguising spell, as in order for it to work, you have to tell the truth. Now, I know you might be thinking, but what's the problem with that? That doesn't sound all that hard. And you might be right, except for one tiny little thing. The whole point of a disguise is that you intend on lying to somebody. If you have to tell the truth when using one, then that completely defeats the purpose of using it. I mean, what was that spell intended for? Masquerade parties? Just contrast this with the bridge scene. They need to get to the other side, and have no way to. So Ian conjures up an invisible bridge, but the stipulation this time is that it'll only work if he believes it's there. Now, that makes much more sense as a stipulation because it doesn't detract from the spell's intended purpose. Because what's the point of a bridge? To get from one side to the other. Having to believe it's there doesn't directly go against that, like having to tell the truth to somebody you're trying to deceive. Seriously, that whole thing is pretty much the equivalent of only being able to conjure up a bridge if you build a railing for it first. Because in that case, what would even be the point of using it, considering you'd have to find another way to the other side anyway? That's how redundant that spell is. Now, I know it could be argued that such a stipulation was made for that particular spell because whoever invented it wouldn't want people abusing it, but if that was indeed the case, then that should be established within the movie. And going back to Pixar's problem with world building, it's never once mentioned why any given spell has the stipulation that it does. So you're simply left to wonder why anyone would ever invent or use a spell that's so counterproductive. Because here's the thing. From a writing standpoint, it's very easy to see why they did it like that. They didn't want it to be easy for Ian and Barley to fool the cops, And given how nervous and prone to panic Ian is, the easiest way for him to have a hard time with the spell is if he can't lie his way out of the situation. And lo and behold, that's exactly how it goes down in the movie. However, that then leads to the aforementioned problem of making the spell look completely redundant. And as I spoke about at length in that world building video I mentioned earlier, this isn't the only time Pixar has had this problem. It's just one of the most glaring. Because a very important rule of fantasy is that the characters must feel like they are inhabiting the world around them, and not that the world is bending to the characters or the story they're in. But because Pixar prioritizes story over everything else, even when they shouldn't be, you end up with scenes like this. To put it simply, that particular spell only makes sense having that particular stipulation in the context of that particular scene. If you remove the spell from that context, then it makes no sense whatsoever, because the writers didn't give any thought to it beyond the scene it would be used in. They never stopped and asked themselves, would it make sense for a spell like this to exist, like any given fantasy writer should do? Now, I know there are some people who would probably still argue that the whole thing does make sense and that I'm just overthinking it, but consider this. Again, we have absolutely no idea why that spell has that stipulation. For all we know, the person who invented it could just be stupid or a huge troll, or that the spell was just created that way in the first place. Again, you can assume it was for altruistic reasons, but the movie offers nothing to support this. Now consider what a disguise is most likely to be used for. Probably either for spying, or for trying to infiltrate something that the user isn't supposed to. Now imagine if they had to tell the truth. How long would that spell honestly last? I don't care what anybody says. Not even the greatest manipulator in the world could make that work. It renders the whole spell completely pointless. And as I said before, the only reason that it was put in the movie was because it suited the story at that particular moment for it to work that way. And the result is a scene that does its job of progressing the story, but also comes across as completely nonsensical if you stop and actually think about it. Okay, I think I've made my point quite clear on that. So now I'd like you to tell me, do you believe the disguise scene in Onward is the perfect example of Pixar's issues with world building and comes across as very redundant? Or do you believe the whole thing makes perfect sense and that I'm the one who's dead wrong? Please let me know what you think in the comments. And remember, you don't have to agree with me if you don't want to. You can think however you'd like to about this. And thank you all for watching. I really appreciate all of it, and I hope to see you all next time.